Now, Jerusalem was just boiled over. Under the previous two, Felix, Albinus, there was a seething, this hatred of Rome in the person of the Procurator. Okay? Under Florus, this seething, this undercurrent, this boiling just boiled over. Because he was just evil. What y'all want to talk about today? Procurators. That sounds, man, good answer. First of all, I have a boo-boo to correct from last week. Well, kind of a boo-boo. So I said that Roman standards, we talked about the Roman standard, the thing they carried around when they fought wars and stuff. I said the Roman standards actually had an image of Jesus on them by the 4th century AD. And I got that quote. I went back to my book. Kenny was looking for that, and he says, I found where Roman standards had images of Christianity on them by the 4th century AD, but not images of Jesus. I said, well, let me go look at that. So I looked in my book, and I found a reference to this book, Killing Jesus by Bill O'Reilly. And on page 101 at the very bottom it says, worth noting is that an image of Jesus would adorn Roman standards beginning in the 4th century AD. And again, I reference that in my book. So I took that to mean an image of Jesus. I don't think that's true. I'm not sure Bill O'Reilly meant that, or he may be confused, but I think it was images of Christianity as opposed to images of Jesus. So thank you, Kennedy. George, for pointing that out. I appreciate that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We covered last week prefects. We finished up Herod the Great. Can you believe it? It was a big day. Yay! And we covered prefects last week. We're going to cover, I hope, procurators, legates, and Syrian governors today. And I'm hoping we're going to start destroying Jerusalem. We're going to get on the very verge of destroying Jerusalem this week, if we have enough time. And then next week, we'll get into destroying Jerusalem and on into Masada. Now, this is where I boo-booed in my book. If you have a copy of my book, it's a big, thick book. And I wrote about Herod the Great, of course. That's between the Testaments, right? He died in 4 BC, so that's legitimate between the Testament material. And that's really kind of when the between the Testaments ended, because Jesus was probably born likely in about 6 BC, 5 or 6 BC, okay? And we can argue 4, 5, 6, 7 BC, somewhere in there, okay? So that, I should have stopped there. But I said, after Herod the Great, who was kind of in charge? Well, okay, it was 3 sons, Antipas, Arcadius, Philip the Tetrarch. And then I kind of went on, I thought, well, who reigned after that? Well, it was the prefects. Well, that's kind of interesting. Well, who ruled after that? Well, it was Herod Agrippa I after the prefects. Well, who was after Herod Agrippa? Well, that was the procurators. And what happened after the procurators? Well, the procurators were so bad it caused the destruction of Jerusalem. And I started reading about that, and I thought, that's cool. I can't believe that's so neat. The destruction of Jerusalem was more about zealots versus Jews versus Jews, instead of Rome versus Jews. Okay? Jerusalem really fell by itself. I mean, Rome came in finally and just completely destroyed it. I mean, they just decimated everything. They completely leveled the Temple Mount, everything in Jerusalem except for Phaseal's Tower. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So I just kind of kept writing and writing. So what we're in now is the chapters of me going out of control, for lack of a better word. And my wife, see? Out of control. That's all I have to say. All right. So we're going to cover, this is kind of bonus material for what really happened between the Testaments. We're going beyond the end of the Intertestament period through the New Testament period. And I told you before, I've taken a chapter out of the book on the life of Jesus and the apostles, and I was going to publish that at some time. I've not done that yet. Maybe someday I will do that. The book was getting so big, and I probably should have taken out all this material as well and stuck to just between the Testaments, but I didn't. I had to leave in all the stuff we're going to cover this week and next week and probably the next week. Okay, we're pretty close to wrapping up the history, though. We're pretty close to finishing the destruction of Jerusalem and the Masada by next week, I hope, and then we'll cover the history of Rome. All along, our focus has been on Judea/Judea. Okay, but we're going to kind of uproot from Judea in the next couple of weeks and go over to Rome when we start chapter 11. We'll talk about the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, how it came about. We'll talk about science fiction, how science fiction really does reflect a lot of stuff that happened in science fact, in historical fact. If you look at Star Wars, if you look at Star Trek, the Romulans, the Remans in Star Trek, if you look at the Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, oh yeah, that was Octavian. That was Octavian big time. Okay, how Palpatine came about in Star Wars is exactly how Octavian came about in the Roman Empire. Chapter 11 in a couple of weeks. We'll start covering that. I digress and get ahead of myself. Let's talk about the procurators. All right. Last week we talked about prefects. This is the prefect timeline. Just a real quick review. Gather it quick. He says he wasn't here last week. So the prefects are right here. The most famous, Pilate, of course. We can line up Pilate with who was reigning at the time, Tiberius. We talked about Tiberius finally recalled, or the Syrian governor actually sent Pilate to Rome to Tiberius to answer for his crimes. His crimes were he could not, for the life of him, keep the peace. And that's probably why we talked about before when the Jews and the priests were saying, kill Jesus, and Pilate was saying, why? He's really not done anything wrong. And they said, kill Jesus or we're going to tell the emperor on you. And Pilate said, oh dear, let's kill Jesus. Because Pilate had done so many things to really make the emperor mad. And he was done. The emperor was pretty close done with him. And the Syrian governor finally sent Pilate to Tiberius. And luckily Tiberius died before Pilate got there. Okay, we talked about that last week. So that's the prefects. All right. The procurators. Now, this is our master chart over here. Remember, don't forget this chart. If I were teaching a college class, I would say memorize every single detail in that chart over there because that is the entire history from the end of the Intertestament period all the way through the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay? So the prefects came, and then Herod Agrippa came, who started ruling the regions in a stepwise fashion, and then the procurators came. The procurators, 8 of them, we're going to talk about 5 of them. We're going to talk about the 4 F's and 1 A. In order, alphabetical order, isn't this cool? Fadus, Felix, Festus, Florus. Almost messed that up. And we're going to talk about Albinus also. Okay? So these guys ruled after the death of Herod Agrippa I. We talked about all the generations of Herod. I hope you have all the Herods completely straight in your mind now. 7 Herods in the New Testament, 4 generations. These guys came after Herod Agrippa I up until the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right, here's our chart again. It's in the book, and I'm going to bring it up several times. The procurators are in purple here. Lighter purple, well, lightish purple here, okay? There are 3 of them that ruled all 8 regions after Herod Agrippa I died, okay? After Herod Agrippa II became king of these 3 regions in 53, and then he added this region and part of this region in 54, the procurator started losing power under Felix. Felix was not a good procurator. We'll talk about him in some detail in just a minute, okay? So he started losing power because of, first of all, Herod Agrippa II coming along, being a pretty good king, and also I think Rome was losing confidence in his ability to keep the peace. He wasn't very good, okay? And then we have the light purple guys, Festus, Albinus, Florus, we're going to talk about those 3, and then finally Julianus, who ruled up until the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? They ruled the 3 regions, or the one region called, and you know the answer to this now, Judea, okay? Judea having been formed in AD 6 after the banishment of Archelaus. All right, so you will see that chart again as we go along. You probably this is probably last week you'll see that chart. You're gonna miss that chart. I just know you will. All right, number 1 procurator, Cuspius Fadus. Now Claudius, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Claudius would have probably just added Judea to the Roman province of Syria, except for 2 things. Herod Agrippa II was young. He was only 17 years old at the time, okay? Number 2, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II's father, okay, and the governor of the Roman Syrian province, a man named Gnaeus Marcus, hated each other, okay? For those 2 reasons, Claudius, the emperor, put procurators over the region instead of just adding it to the Syrian province. If he had done one of 2 things, either one, if he had let Herod Agrippa II become king over those provinces, or if he had added those provinces to the Syrian province, the greater Syrian province, as opposed to putting procurators over those regions, the Jewish war probably never would have happened, and the Jewish temple might still be there today. Don't know. I mean, you never know what history is, okay? But I always like asking myself what-if questions. What if this had happened? Well, that's what would have happened. It probably would have survived AD 70, okay, because the Romans wouldn't have had to come in, because the Syrians wouldn't have done the kinds of things that procurators had done, I don't think. We're going to talk about a couple of good Syrian governors, a couple of good people who were really good to the Jews, okay? All right, so Claudius put procurators over the Judean province. One thing happened during Fadus' term. Claudius ordered the high priest's garments moved from the temple to the Antonia fortress during the time of Fadus. Herod Agrippa II interceded on the Jews' behalf, and Claudius relented, so they were able to keep the high priest. And that's kind of a big deal to the Jews, right? You know, we want to keep control of the high priest garments. Claudius wanted to keep more control. The Jews obviously wanted to keep control. Josephus thought a lot of Fadus. He said he's a pretty good guy. Judea was cleared of robberies by the care and providence of Fadus. All right, next up, we're going to skip a couple of procurators, but we're going to go straight to number 4, Felix. Bad guy. The reign of Felix ushered in an increase in crime and unrest in Judea. He decided to kill the high priest at one point. He wasn't allowed to do that. I mean, yeah, sure, there was people who were allowed to kill the high priest, but Herod Agrippa was the guy that was allowed to do that, not Felix. Okay, Herod Agrippa II specifically. Felix suppressed a quarrel between the Jews and Samaritans and ended up killing a bunch of Jews, plundered their houses. He was not a popular guy with the Jews. Okay. Interestingly enough, his second wife, Drusilla, they had a son. He and Drusilla had a son, Marcus Antonius Agrippa, and this son was one of 2 named people that died in the Mount Vesuvius eruption, okay, in AD 79. The other one being Pliny the Elder. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Their son, Marcus Antonius Agrippa, died in that eruption. Felix, we know about him in the Bible. We talk about this overlap of history that we're talking about with biblical history. Okay, so we see Felix in the Bible in Acts 22 through 24. The quick story is Paul was in Jerusalem, and he was being harassed by the Jews because Paul was telling a story, how I was converted on the road to Damascus, how Jesus is the Christ, Jesus is the Messiah that we read about in the Old Testament. Jews would have nothing to do with that. They were on to him, they were getting ready to kill him. The Romans arrested him and were getting ready to scourge him, and he said, what did he say? I'm a Roman citizen. You can't scourge me. Okay? And then they took him to the Sanhedrin, and then Paul stirred up the Sanhedrin. Remember the fat Pharisees, Sadducees thing? Got them kind of worked against each other. Okay? And the Romans got him, had to get him again. Okay? Interesting stuff in Acts 22 through 24. Okay? So they interviewed again. Paul found out through his nephew, his sister's son, that his life was in danger. Okay? And so the Romans ended up sending him to Caesarea on regard of, we read about this in the Bible, okay, in Acts 23, I think, 24. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. That's a lot of soldiers to protect one guy. So from Jerusalem to Caesarea, they took Paul under the arrest of the procurator, Felix. Felix, as I mentioned before, he lost 3.5 of the regions during his rule, okay, because Herod Agrippa was getting more and more control. Again, Herod Agrippa II never had control of Judea. If he had, things would have been different. Nero ended up replacing Felix in 60 with Festus. Okay? Now, Festus wasn't a horrible guy. When Festus came to office, the Jews petitioned to have Paul transferred back to Jerusalem with the intent of killing him during the transfer. Same thing, overlap with the history and the history. Okay? Secular history and biblical history. When Festus asked Paul if he wanted to go to Jerusalem for trial, Paul said, no. Because he found out about the intent to kill him on the way to Jerusalem. So he wasn't going to have anything to do with that. And he, at that point, appealed to the emperor. I appealed to the emperor. Well, do we read about in the Bible who that emperor was? No. But we know it was the Emperor Nero. Okay? Nero is not a nice guy either. We're going to talk about these emperors as we go along. Who the bad guys were: Caligula, really bad guy. Nero, really bad guy. Some nicer emperors. Claudius was kind of a nicer emperor. Octavian, early on, the first emperor, was a pretty nice emperor. We'll talk about that under chapter 11, okay? So Paul appealed to Nero, okay? And Festus ended up having Agrippa II and Bernice, Agrippa's sister, come visit him. And he was perplexed. He was saying to them, I can't figure out what to write. This guy has appealed, Paul has appealed to Rome. I don't know what to write the emperor about him. Help me. And they said, all right, call him out here. So Paul came before Festus, Agrippa II, and Bernice, and presented his defense. And Agrippa, after the end of this, said, you know what? This man could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to the emperor. Festus is the only procurator to have died in office in AD 62. Next up, Albinus, bad guy. He was on the way to Jerusalem, and just kind of an aside, Annas II, a high priest, he had James, brother of Jesus, killed. Now, we've seen his ossuary. Kenny and I and the girls went to Atlanta about a month or 6 weeks ago or something, and saw the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus. This guy that was killed by Annas II, this high priest, okay? That was not allowed. Annas was not allowed to just kill people at will, okay? So Agrippa II and Albinus were both livid over this, okay, that Annas had killed this guy, Jesus' brother, okay? So Albinus said he was going to punish him when he got in town, but Agrippa kind of preempted that by just going ahead and replacing Annas II as high priest, and he only reigned as high priest for 3 months. Josephus did not speak highly of Albinus. He said there was not any sort of wickedness that could be named, but he had a hand in it. When he found out that he was going to be replaced by Florus, he executed all the prisoners that were in prison for bigger crimes, murder or whatever, okay? And anybody that would pay him a bribe, give me a little money, we'll let you out of prison. And, anybody that would do that, he would let him out of prison. So by the time Florus came along, the prisons were empty, because he'd executed everybody who was a hardened criminal, and he had taken a bribe from anybody who was a lesser criminal, okay? And Jerusalem was overrun with these criminals. Well, that's a problem, okay? But also, Florus coming into town was a problem also. He was probably the worst procurator to have ever, maybe one of the worst guys who have ever ruled over anybody. He was so bad that the Jews considered Albinus a good guy. And Albinus was not a good guy, okay? Josephus tells us that he brought an abundance of miseries on the region, and he did his unjust notions to the harm of the nation after a pompous manner. He stole 17 talents of money from the temple, millions and millions of dollars. The Jews even started mocking him, saying, "Oh, poor Florus, he doesn't have any money." And they started taking up a collection for him. They go through the street. Can you give a little piece of money for Florus? He's so poor. He didn't like that. He didn't see the humor in it like they did, and he plundered Jerusalem, and he killed a bunch of Jews, and he crucified them there in Jerusalem. About 3,600 Jews. Not a nice guy. He was so bad that he wanted the Jews to go to war with Rome. Because after all, if you're in a war with Rome, you don't care about the things he's really done in the past, right? He's really a bad procurator. But if you got a war, I had a boss who used to say, you got to worry about the alligators in the tent nipping at your armpits before you worry about the alligators outside the tent. That's the same thing with war with Rome. You got to worry about the current war with Rome. You don't worry about stuff that Florus has done in the past. So he wanted the Jews to go to war with Rome, and he got his wish bigly. Okay? Bernice, the sister of Agrippa II, even came to Florus and pleaded with him, said, "Please stop." But she ended up having to flee for her life. The sister of the king, King Agrippa, she fled for her life as well. The Jews appealed to Agrippa II, and he tried his best to do something about it. He encouraged him not to go to war. He said, "This is not going to end well for you. It's happened over and over and over again. It never ends well for people. Do not go to war with the Romans." And Florus just instigated it. At the same time, Eleazar, who was a high priest emeritus, he said, "You know what? I'm going to disallow sacrifices at the temple from now on from foreigners, including the emperor." That didn't go well. Josephus says that this was the true beginning of war with the Romans. Now, Jerusalem was just boiled over. Under the previous two, Felix, Albinus, there was a seething, this hatred of Rome in the person of the Procurator. Okay? Under Florus, this seething, this undercurrent, this boiling just boiled over. Because he was just evil. He was just evil. And there was a civil war going on. There were zealots who said, "We've got to go to Rome. We are not going to put up with this anymore." And there were other people saying, "It doesn't end well. If we go to Rome, it will not end well." And they were trying to not go to Rome, but the zealots said, "We will go to Rome." And again, that's what caused Jerusalem to fall was this turmoil, this civil war going on within Jerusalem. Okay, we're going to cover that next week, I hope, okay, about how bad things were in Jerusalem. And they were bad. They were really, really bad. Okay. If you have the book, read the section on Gessius Florus, 296 through 300, and you'll see some more details about that. Now, we find out that Cestius Gallus, who was a Roman governor of the Syrian province, almost conquered the region in AD 66. We'll talk about that in a second. So here's a Procurator timeline. Procurators here at the bottom. The most famous ones, of course, Florus right here. Okay, he was the instigator of everything. And we see how they kind of line up with the Roman emperors, the Roman Syrian governors, and we see kind of the line of succession from Herod Agrippa I when he died, how then the Procurators took over, and then the fall of Jerusalem and all of Judea in AD 70. All right. So let's finish up our talk of who was in charge of the region, and we'll start talking about the destruction that started taking place. Okay. The office of legate was established by Vespasian when he came to office in AD 69. Jerusalem and all of Judea was just a mess. They were a seething mess of stuff going on. There were only 3 legates in our period of study. Cyrillus from AD 70 to 71. This was after the destruction of Jerusalem, which we'll talk about next week. Bassus from AD 71 to 72. And Silva from 72 to 81. Silva, arguably, being the most important, the most interesting historically because, why? Masada in AD 73 fell under Silva. He was the one responsible for building this giant ramp straight up in the air. And we've been to Masada. I'll show you a picture of this. He spent weeks and weeks and weeks building this ramp to get up to this giant plateau in the desert that they finally took after building this ramp up. We'll talk about that. That was Silva. He was a pretty accomplished fellow. He ended up becoming a Roman consul after his time as Roman Syrian governor. Okay, the legates continued to rule over Judea through the end of the Marcus Antonius Revolt in AD 136, when the province was named Syria Palestina. And I started to go on and say, this Marcus Antonius Revolt's kind of cool too. And I said, no, we're stopping at AD 70. We're cutting this off. All right, Syrian governors. Okay, the Syrian governors were over everybody we've talked about so far, right? They were over the prefects. They were over the procurators, okay? They were the boss, okay? They were over the client kings, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II. These guys were in charge. These guys answered to the emperor himself, okay? Because Judea was a sub-province, really, of the Syrian province, okay? Their home was in Antioch, Syria. Recall that the home of the prefects and procurators was in Caesarea Maritima, specifically, okay, on the coast. We talked about that last week. The home of the kings were in various places. Herod the Great was in Jerusalem, but he had palaces all over the place. Herod Agrippa I was in Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa II, remember, he never quite made it over to rule the region of Judea, but he had palaces in modern-day Beirut, Caesarea, Chalcis, Jerusalem. He had palaces everywhere, but he never was over the region of Judea, including Jerusalem. Okay. Syrian governors were typically proconsuls, pro meaning former, so they were former consuls of Rome, and were typically appointed by the emperor. They ruled the Syrian province from the time Rome gained control in 63 BC. Remember back, oh my goodness, that's been a long time ago. Talking about the history of Pompey taking Jerusalem in 63 BC. That's how long these guys were in charge of the Syrian province, these governors. So they maintained control until AD 70. Except for the period between BC 40 to 39 when the Parthians had control. We talked about that during the time of Herod the Great, when Herod the Great was running all over the place, and he ended up running to Cleopatra in Egypt, and then went to Rome, and they declared him the king of the Jews, and he came back and was able to take over the region, okay, from the Parthians. And table 9.5 in the book, if you're interested, list all 46 terms of the Syrian governors, 44 people, 46 terms, and we're going to talk about 2 of those guys, Vitellius and Petronius. So these are the ones we're going to talk about. These 2 in a little bit more detail, these kind of in passing. This guy here, number 39, this is the guy that Herod Agrippa they were not happy with each other. Okay, and he's the reason that the region got put under procurators. Okay. This guy we're going to talk about here in just a minute because he started taking over. He started suppressing the Jewish Revolt in AD 66. Okay. Now these 2 guys, these were actually pretty good guys, governors. Vitellius, he was good to the Jews, and Publius Petronius was good to the Jews. Let's talk about that in some detail. So Vitellius, he put the priestly garments back in control of the Jews. Okay, these priestly garments are kind of a big deal about who had control of them. The Jews were very particular about their priestly garments. He provided tax relief during Passover. He's actually removed Joseph Caiaphas as high priest. He's the one we're most familiar with, right, the New Testament. And he was the father of the short-lived Roman Emperor Vitellius, one of the emperors in the year of the 4 emperors, where 3 of the emperors, it did not end well with them. Okay. In fact, he lost his head over that. Publius Petronius, he stood up for the Jews at a great risk to himself. It turns out that the Jews started revolting, or not revolting, but basically not paying respect to Caligula. Bad emperor, bad guy. Okay. And he got replaced by Petronius. And he told Petronius, I'm so sick of these Jews. What I want you to do is I want you to put a statue of me in their temple. Jews weren't keen on the idea. And they revolted, but they revolted peacefully. And they went to Petronius and said, please don't do this. And said, 10,000 of them. They laid on the ground and bared their neck and said, just kill us. Kill us before doing this. And Petronius said, you know what? He thought it was a horrible thing for him to be such a slave to the madness of Caius, Caligula. That's who Josephus calls him, Caius. He told them that he would deal with the emperor, and he wrote a letter to the emperor explaining to him the situation. Now, how do you think that's going to go with Caligula? Total madman. In the meantime, Agrippa I, remember we talked about Agrippa I and Caligula, they grew up together in Rome. They were good friends. Agrippa threw a big feast for Caligula, and Caligula enjoyed it so much he said, what do you want? It's like these people always did. What do you want? I'll give you half the kingdom. It's kind of talk, I guess. And Agrippa said, please reconsider putting your statue in the temple. Agrippa was a good, solid Jew. We talked about him. Good to the Jews, bad to the Christians. Jews, Christians, okay? Agrippa I. And Caligula agreed. He said, all right, you were my good friend. Thank you for throwing this nice feast for me. I agree. Let's not put the statue in the temple. In the meantime, the letter from Petronius arrived. Oh dear. Caligula wrote back and said, don't you dare defy the order of the emperor ever again. I want you to kill yourself. Luckily for Petronius, Caligula got killed before Petronius had to kill himself. Petronius got word that Caligula was dead, that he was assassinated, 27 days before he got the letter from Caligula telling him to kill himself. But Petronius was a man of character. And I want to always talk about him because we don't see often men of real character in these times. He stood up for the Jews. He said it is a mad thing to put the statue of Caligula in the temple. And that y'all are laying here on the ground. I'm not going to kill 10,000 of you because you're saying do it. Please do that instead of letting the statue go in the temple. He was reasonable, and he was good to the Jews. And I want to give him a thumbs up, a historical thumbs up. All right? And Vitellius also. All right. So this is on page question mark of the book. And the reason that's page question mark is that's from the chapter that I pulled out. But if you notice, these are selected people, the Bible, all the apostles, Jesus, etc. The only one who lived to see the destruction from afar, from Patmos probably, was John the Apostle. When Jerusalem fell in AD 70, he was probably the only one of the biblical people that were still alive. All right. Chapter 10. Oh dear, we're almost out of time. All right, brief history. You've seen it all before. I'm going to go through it real quick. From the birth of Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Israel's ruled by 3 distinct groups of people. The Herodians, part 1, under Herod the Great and his sons. The Prefects, 7 total, Pontius Pilate being the most famous. The Herodians, part 2, under Agrippa I, and then Agrippa II kind of encroaching on and almost took everything, except he didn't get those 3 regions, or the region of Judaea. And then the Procurators, 8 of those total, who ruled all the regions first, and then as Herod Agrippa came along, ended up with ruling only 3 regions. The most famous for historians is Florus. Okay? If I were teaching a class, I would say become very familiar with Florus. He's going to be on a test. All right. Here's our chart again. Probably beat this to death, but here they are over all 8 regions, and then over 3 regions as Herod Agrippa the second took over. All right. Part 2. Stuff leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. The seeds of revolt were planted by the 2 bad procurators, Felix and Albinus. Okay? Felix had the high priest Jonathan killed. He didn't have the ability to remove him. He was not allowed to do that because that was under the purview of Agrippa II at the time. He also killed a bunch of other Jews. He settled a dispute with Caesarea and ended up killing a bunch of Jews there and plundered their houses. Jews were not happy with him. Again, the seething revolt against the Romans, specifically in the character of the Procurator. Albinus, there was not any sort of wickedness, as I mentioned, that Albinus didn't have a hand in, and he executed all the prisoners or took bribes from the prisoners and emptied the prisons. Part 3, Jewish revolt became rampant under Gessius Florus. We talked about this already. He brought on Judea an abundance of misery and did his unjust notions to the harm of the nation after a pompous manner. He was so bad, the Jews considered Albinus a good guy. He stole money from the temple. We talked about all this already, and ended up where Cestius Gallus, the Syrian governor, came in and started to squash the revolt that was going on. This is what that looks like. Okay. So, Rome at first didn't take the revolt as seriously as they could have, I guess, because they sent in a local Syrian governor. And it turns out Agrippa was helping. Agrippa, who was over these other regions, remember, Agrippa II, over these other regions, he was helping to squash the revolt. Okay? So, I'm going to skip all the details of items 1 through 11, but item 12 shows that Gallus besieged Jerusalem, but for some unknown reason, I don't remember reading it. I should go back and research that maybe a little bit more, but for some unknown reason, he broke off this siege. He was right on the verge of taking Jerusalem, and he broke it off right at the last minute. Don't know why. If he had, he would have killed a bunch of Jews, but he would have saved a whole bunch more Jews' lives, because later on when Rome came in 67 through 73, that we'll talk about next week, they killed a lot more Jews than Gallus would have. Anyway, Gallus broke off the siege, and he started, kind of retreating from the region. The Jews took off after him, and they pretty much destroyed his army. And the Jews said, "We got this. Oh, yeah, we're going to win over the Romans. No problem. Look what we did." In 66. Yeah, didn't really work that way for him. AD 67, Gallus was replaced by Vespasian. We've heard of him, right? The great general Vespasian. He came in with 2 legions, Legion 5 and 10. Titus, his son, brought a legion from Egypt, Legion 15. We'll talk about the makeup of what the Roman legions were in a few weeks when we start talking about the Roman military, okay? It was a lot of people, and it was a lot of people that were really, really well trained. So they brought in all these men, probably about the time 6,000 men, plus all the support animals and troops and whatever. So 10,000 maybe per legion. So maybe 30,000 men came in, and he traveled to Ptolemais, which became kind of a base of operations, and of course Caesarea was a base of operations also. Okay, that's in 67. First of all, Ptolemais and Sepphoris surrendered peacefully. We're going to go through these very quickly. Next up, Jotapata. Jotapata is something, if I were teaching in class, I'd say you better remember this name. Jotapata, initial revolt attack by Placidus, one of the Roman generals. The inhabitants of Garrus fled before Romans arrived. Josephus, a very important person, the commander of the Jewish forces of Galilee, we're going to talk about him in some detail in a minute. He fled to Tiberias at this time. Gadara fell. Jotapata was besieged by Vespasian. In the meantime, the double-walled city of Jaffa fell to Trajan, one of the Roman generals, the father of the Emperor Trajan later on. Mount Gerizim, down in Samaria, fell to the Romans, okay, in 67. And then finally, Jotapata fell to Vespasian, and Josephus was captured. Okay. Next week, we will talk about the battle for Jotapata, and we'll talk about the battle for the soul of Josephus. Okay. Josephus was a Jewish commander who turned traitor big time and became a patron of Rome, a patron of the emperor, or soon-to-be Emperor Vespasian. Okay? But luckily for us, he survived because we got a lot of information from him on what was going on during those times. Thank y'all for coming today. See y'all next week. Oh, it's getting exciting now. You don't want to miss next week.